The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 29. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Goethe, Volume 1, by Johann von Goethe, translated by John Oxenford, Section 29. Ninth Book, Part 1. Reader's Note. In the following paragraph, Goethe is quoting another writer. The heart is often affected, moreover, to the advantage of different, but especially of social and refined virtues, and the more tender sentiments are excited and unfolded in it. Many touches in particular will impress themselves, which give the young reader an insight into the more hidden corner of the human heart and its passions, a knowledge which is more worth than all Latin and Greek, and of which Ovid was a very excellent master. But yet it is not on this account that the classic poets, and therefore Ovid, are placed in the hands of youth. We have received from a kind Creator a variety of mental powers, to which we must not neglect giving their proper culture in our earliest years, and which cannot be cultivated either by logic or metaphysics, Latin or Greek. We have an imagination, before which, since it should not seize upon the very first conceptions that chance to present themselves, we ought to place the fittest and most beautiful images, and thus accustom and practice the mind to recognize and love the beautiful everywhere, and in nature itself, under its determined, true, and also in its finer features. A multitude of conceptions and general knowledge is necessary to us, as well for the sciences as for daily life, which can be learned out of no compendium. Our feelings, affections, and passions should be advantageously developed and purified. Reader's Note, end of quotation. This significant passage, which is found in the Universal German Library, was not the only one of its kind. Similar principles and similar views manifested themselves in many directions. They made upon us lively youths a very great impression, which had the more decided effect as it was strengthened besides by Wieland's example, for the works of his second brilliant period clearly showed that he had formed himself according to such maxims. And what more could we desire? Philosophy, with its abstruse questions, was set aside. The classic languages, the acquisition of which is accompanied by so much drudgery, one saw thrust into the background. The compendiums, about the sufficiency of which Hamlet had already whispered a word of caution into our ears, came more and more into suspicion. We were directed to the contemplation of an active life, which we were so fond of leading, and to the knowledge of the passions, which we partly felt, partly anticipated in our own bosoms, and which, if, though they had been rebuked formerly, now appeared to us as something important and dignified, because they were to be the chief object of our studies, and the knowledge of them was extolled as the most excellent means of cultivating our mental powers. Besides, such a mode of thought was quite in accordance with my own conviction, nay, with my poetical mode of treatment. I therefore, without opposition, after I had thwarted so many good designs and seen so many fair hopes vanish, reconciled myself to my father's intention of sending me to Strasbourg, where I was promised a cheerful, gay life, while I should prosecute my studies, and at last take my degree. In spring I felt my health, but still more my youthful spirits, restored, and once more longed to be out of my father's house, though with reasons far different from those on the first time. The pretty chambers and spots where I had suffered so much had become disagreeable to me, and with my father himself there could be no pleasant relation. I could not quite pardon him for having manifested more impatience than was reasonable at the relapse of my disease and at my tedious recovery; nay, for having, instead of comforting me by forbearance, frequently expressed himself in a cruel manner about that which lay in no man's hand, as if it depended only on the will. And he too was in various ways hurt and offended by me. For young people bring back from the university general ideas, which indeed is quite right and good, but because they fancy themselves very wise in this, they apply them as a standard to the objects that occur, which must then for the most part lose by the comparison. Thus I had gained a general notion of architecture and of the arrangement and decoration of houses, and imprudently in conversation had applied this to our own house. My father had designed the whole arrangement of it, and carried out its construction with great perseverance, and considering that it was to be exclusively a residence for himself and his family, nothing could be objected to it. In this taste also very many of the houses in Frankfurt were built. An open staircase ran up through the house, and touched upon large anterooms, which might very well have been chambers themselves, as indeed we always passed the fine season in them. But this pleasant, cheerful existence for a single family, this communication from above to below, became the greatest inconvenience as soon as several parties occupied the house, as we had but too well experienced on the occasion of the French quartering. For that painful scene with the King's lieutenant would not have happened; nay, my father would even have felt all those disagreeable matters less, if, after the Leipzig fashion, our staircase had run close along the side of the house, and a separate door had been given to each story. This style of building I once praised highly for its advantages, and showed my father the possibility of altering his staircase also, whereat he got into an incredible passion, which was the more violent, as a short time before I had found fault with some scrolled looking-glass frames, and rejected certain Chinese hangings. A scene ensued, which indeed was again hushed up and smothered, but it hastened my journey to the beautiful Alsace, which I accomplished in a newly contrived, comfortable diligence, without delay, and in a short time. I had alighted at the Geist tavern, and hastened at once to satisfy my most earnest desire, and to approach the Minster, which had long since been pointed out to me by fellow travellers, and had been before my eyes for a great distance. When I first perceived this colossus through the narrow lanes, and then stood too near before it in the truly confined little square, it made upon me an impression quite of its own kind, which I, being unable to analyze on the spot, carried with me only indistinctly for this time, as I hastily ascended the building, so as not to neglect the beautiful moment of a high and cheerful sun, which was to disclose to me at once the broad, rich land. And now, from the platform, I saw before me the beautiful country in which I should for a long time live and reside, the handsome city, the wide-spreading meadows around it, thickly set and interwoven with magnificent trees, that striking richness of vegetation which follows in the windings of the Rhine, marks its banks, islands, and aits. Nor is the level ground stretching down from the south, and watered by the Iller, less adorned with varied green. Even westward, towards the mountains, there are many low grounds which afford quite as charming a view of wood and meadow growth, just as the northern and more hilly part is intersected by innumerable little brooks, which promote a rapid vegetation everywhere. If one imagines, between these luxuriantly outstretched meads, between these joyously scattered groves, all land adapted for tillage, excellently prepared, verdant, and ripening, and the best and richest spots marked by hamlets and farmhouses, and this great and immeasurable plain prepared for man like a new paradise, bounded far and near by mountains partly cultivated, partly overgrown with woods, he will then conceive the rapture with which I blessed my fate, that it had destined me for some time so beautiful a dwelling place. Such a fresh glance into a new land, in which we are to abide for a time, has still the peculiarity, both pleasant and foreboding, that the whole lies before us like an unwritten tablet. As yet no sorrows and joys which relate to ourselves are recorded upon it. This cheerful, varied, animated plain is still mute for us. The eye is only fixed on the objects so far as they are intrinsically important, and neither affection nor passion has especially to render prominent this or that spot. But a presentiment of the future already disquiets the young heart, and an unsatisfied craving secretly demands that which is to come and may come, and which, at all events, whether for good or ill, will imperceptibly assume the character of the spot in which we find ourselves. Having descended the height, I still tarried a while before the face of the venerable pile, but what I could not quite clearly make out, either the first or the following time, was that I regarded this miracle as a monster, which must have terrified me, if it had not at the same time appeared to me comprehensible by its regularity, and even pleasing in its finish. Yet I by no means busied myself with meditating on this contradiction, but suffered a monument so astonishing quietly to work upon me by its presence. I took small but well situated and pleasant lodgings on the north side of the fish market, a fine long street where the everlasting motion came to the assistance of every unoccupied moment. I then delivered my letters of introduction, and found among my patrons a merchant who, with his family, was devoted to those pious opinions sufficiently known to me, although as far as regarded external worship he had not separated from the church. He was a man of intelligence withal, and by no means hypocritical in his conduct. The company of boarders which was recommended to me, and indeed I to it, was very agreeable and entertaining. A couple of old maids had long kept up this boarding house with regularity and good success. There might have been about 10 persons, older and younger. Of these latter, one named Meyer, a native of Lindau, is most vividly present to my mind. From his form and face, he might have been considered one of the handsomest of men, if, at the same time, he had not had something of the sloven in his whole appearance. In like manner, his splendid natural talents were marred by an incredible levity, and his excellent temper by an unbounded dissoluteness. He had an open, jovial face, rather more round than oval. The organs of the senses, the eyes, nose, mouth, and ears, could be called rich. They showed a decided fullness without being too large. His mouth was particularly charming, owing to his curling lips, and his whole physiognomy had the peculiar expression of a rake, from the circumstance that his eyebrows met across his nose, which in a handsome face always produces a pleasant expression of sensuality. By his jovialness, sincerity, and good nature, he made himself beloved by all. His memory was incredible. Attention at the lectures was no effort for him. He retained all he heard, and was intellectual enough to take an interest in everything, and this the more easily as he was studying medicine. All his impressions remained vivid, and his waggery in repeating the lectures and mimicking the professors often went so far that when he had heard 3 different lectures in one morning, he would at the dinner table interchange the professors with each other, paragraph-wise, and often even more abruptly, which motley lecture frequently entertained us, but often too became troublesome. The rest were more or less polite, steady, serious people. A pensioned knight of the Order of St. Louis was one of these, but the majority were students, all really good and well disposed, only they were not allowed to go beyond their usual allowance of wine. That this should not be easily done was the care of our president, one Dr. Salzmann. Already in the 60s and unmarried, he had attended this dinner table for many years, and maintained its good order and respectability. He possessed a handsome property, kept himself close and neat in his exterior, even belonging to those who always go in shoes and stockings, and with their hat under their arm. To put on the hat was with him an extraordinary action. He commonly carried an umbrella, wisely reflecting that the finest summer days often bring thunderstorms and passing showers over the country. With this man I talked over my design of continuing to study jurisprudence at Strasbourg, so as to be able to take my degree as soon as possible. Since he was exactly informed of everything, I asked him about the lectures I should have to hear, and what he generally thought of the matter. To this he replied that it was not in Strasbourg as in the German universities, where they try to educate jurists in the large and learned sense of the term. Here, in conformity with the relation towards France, all was really directed to the practical, and managed in accordance with the opinions of the French, who readily stop at what is given. They tried to impart to everyone certain general principles and preliminary knowledge. They compressed as much as possible, and communicated only what was most necessary. Hereupon he made me acquainted with a man in whom, as a répétent, répétent is one of a class of persons to be found in the German universities, and who assist students in their studies. They are somewhat analogous to the English tutors, but not precisely, for the latter render their aid before the recitation, while the répétent repeats with the student in private the lectures he has previously heard from the professor. Hence his name, which might be rendered repeater, had we any corresponding class of men in England or America which would justify an English word. American note. Great confidence was entertained, which he very soon managed to gain from me also. By way of introduction, I began to speak with him on the subjects of jurisprudence, and he wondered not a little at my swaggering, for during my residence at Leipzig I had gained more of an insight into the requisites for the law than I have hitherto taken occasion to state in my narrative, though all I had acquired could only be reckoned as a general encyclopedical survey, and not as proper definite knowledge. University life, even if in the course of it we may not exactly have to boast of industry, nevertheless affords endless advantages in every kind of cultivation, because we are always surrounded by men who either possess or are seeking science, so that even if unconsciously we are constantly drawing some nourishment from such an atmosphere. My répétent, after he had had patience with my rambling discourse for some time, gave me at last to understand that I must first of all keep my immediate object in view, which was to be examined, to take my degree, and then perchance to commence practice. Regarding the former, said he, the subject is by no means investigated at large. It is inquired how and when a law arose, and what gave the internal or external occasion for it. There is no inquiry as to how it has been altered by time and custom, or how far it has perhaps been perverted by false interpretation or the perverted usage of the courts. It is in such investigations that learned men quite peculiarly spend their lives, whereas we inquire into that which exists at present. This we stamp firmly on our memory, that it may always be ready when we wish to employ it for the use and defence of our clients. Thus we qualify our young people for their future life, and the rest follows in proportion to their talents and activity. Hereupon he handed me his pamphlets, which were written in question and answer, and in which I could have stood a pretty good examination at once, for Hopp's smaller law catechism was yet perfectly in my memory. The rest I supplied with some diligence, and against my will qualified myself in the easiest manner as a candidate. But since in this way all my own activity in the study was cut off, for I had no sense for anything positive, but wished to have everything explained historically, if not intelligibly, I found for my powers a wider field, which I employed in the most singular manner, by devoting myself to a matter of interest which was accidentally presented to me from without. End of Section 29.